Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We've got a really interesting guest tonight. Eric Lombardi is our guest, and he wrote a really fascinating article that I think is something that we need to really listen to. And it is "It's Time to Make the Liberal Party Liberal Again" was his title. He was writing a speech that he wished Mark Carney or Chrystia Freeland would have given to launch their leadership campaigns. Fascinating position to take. Eric has got an interesting background. He is the volunteer head of an organization in Toronto that is called More Neighbors Toronto. So I guess he's working hard at trying to increase housing. Eric, welcome to the show.
Hey, Brian, thank you for having me on.
My pleasure. So let's just start with your organization and where you're coming from before we get into the speech that you wrote. What is your organization?
Yeah, so More Neighbors Toronto is a housing advocacy organization that's aiming to solve the housing crisis inflicting our region with solutions that gear us towards housing abundance. So, in many ways, we've really limited our capacity and ability to build housing to meet the demands of the population. And governments across the board have, in many ways, taken property rights away from many people. And the consequence has been limiting the amount of land that's available for us to build on, depriving people, might be homeowners, of the ability to even expand their properties and be part of the solution, and have increased taxes tremendously. And so my organization seeks to combat sort of the policy failures that have resulted in my generation in particular being pushed out of the Canadian dream.
Well, that sounds like a huge topic that we should talk about, and hopefully we'll have time to talk about. But now let's switch to this article that you wrote, which is "It's time to make the Liberal Party liberal again." Why isn't the Liberal Party liberal?
I think, the crux of the criticism here is the Liberal Party has lost a bit of the plot on the fundamentals that drive outcomes for people that make them feel more materially prosperous, in control of their own lives, etc. And I just started on the topic of housing, but if we look at the record for the last 10 years in a place like, for example, in Toronto, we've seen housing prices more than double, and incomes for the cohort aged, 25 to 34 have actually fallen in real terms since then. And so even if the Liberals will talk about things like how they've spent $80 billion accelerating new housing projects, the outcomes haven't been there. And it's not there for a variety of different reasons. And that includes the public policy side around housing, CMHC, and frankly, our pathetic provinces. But then we also have the challenge of major failures in immigration. And if you look broadly at the Trudeau era, we focused a lot on rhetoric, feel good, the really hard policy changes that really add up and materialize over, a 10-year period. Those things really never got done. We've had a productivity crisis for 25 years now in this country, and there's very little response on that particular problem. And so I think what Liberals have failed to do is recognize and gear how they approach public policy in the foundational liberal values of freedom, merit, and the individual's right to prosper.
Yeah, I got to read the paragraph that you wrote on that topic. Canada's foundation and that of the modern West isn't found in religion or ethnicity. It's rooted in liberalism. Liberalism empowers individuals, insists on accountable secular governance, and unites our diverse communities around liberty. It rewards merit through open markets, protects people via property rights, and upholds fairness under the rule of law. When these pillars are strong, a society becomes free, confident, and prosperous. This is more than just our national heritage. It's the namesake of our Liberal Party. It's a legacy we should proudly uphold. So you don't think we've been doing that? Or at least the Liberal Party hasn't been doing that?
I don't think the Liberal Party has been doing that. And I think the Liberal Party, given liberal is its namesake, needs to understand that, it is the champion of some of these beliefs. And if those beliefs are not translating into the outcomes in Canada, then I think that is a failure of the Liberal Party. And so here's another example. Canada's economy has really oligopolized. And 10 years ago, we did
Oh
have
God, is that a
dominant.
word? I like it. Oligopolized. That's a good word.
So essentially, what's happened is, about a third of our economy is sort of dominated by these regulated monopolies. I work in financial services. I'm a management consultant. And in Canada, for example, we have 11 different financial service regulators. And one of the consequences of that is if you are a local small bank in Saskatchewan, you can't go immediately work in Manitoba. But what this has done is it's actually created fiefdoms that have allowed, for example, our biggest banks, about six of them, to control about 90% of the market. If you look at telecom, we've had major foreign ownership restrictions that have ensured that we have a triopoly in TELUS, Rogers, and Bell largely across the country. If you look at airlines, the same thing. If you look at even how we build and plan our cities around commercial space, it has been a major handout to the major grocery chains. And so, in so many ways, we've allowed public policy to enable what is called regulatory capture by the dominant economic interests at the deprivation of competition. And that lack of competition means less investment. And particularly if you're a young person, that lack of investment means fewer opportunities, less career growth, lower wages. And that affects us for our entire lives. And so the Liberal Party has lost an eye on some of these foundational principles that, you're not libertarian, right? One of the mandates of government must be that the markets that exist in the country where we allow the private sector to exist must be competitive. And have you heard a liberal talk about how important that is? I don't think I have.
So one of the issues that you address specifically in the article is scrapped pipelines, and that we've, you say, failed to build the infrastructure we need to get our energy to market. And you said that we've implemented, I'm going to quote again here from your article, we've implemented too much bureaucratic red tape and spent too much time consulting and dithering instead of acting and delivering, which frankly sounds almost exactly like your argument on housing as well. So
Yeah.
in both housing and on pipelines, we've consulted and dithered and had bureaucratic red tape. What would you do?
So, there's a couple of solutions here. So for national projects in the national interest, one of the things that scrapped Energy East is provinces that were impacted by its construction said that they need to all run independent environmental and regulatory assessments, differing from a unified national process. So if you have Ontario and Quebec and New Brunswick all running their own regulatory processes rather than a unified national one for a project of national scale, one of the outcomes of that was to deter the investment and the project from going forward. And this was made kind of clear by Quebec in particular at the time, right?
So
So national.
Alberta took the federal government to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found that actually it was the federal government that was interfering in provincial jurisdiction.
Well, yeah, so what we will need reform on at a federal level is for national projects for them to be assessed by one regulatory body in a national way. And, what would I say? And, this is actually broad when it
I
comes
can't
to
believe
all
Danielle Smith agreed to that.
interprovincial trade barriers in general are basically a consequence of regulatory powers having been devolved from when Canada became established as a country to the provinces. And then those rules, for example, diverging from one another province to province. So there's going to need to be federal leadership there to say, hey, the fundamental structure of how we allow these decisions to occur has become against our own interests from both a national economic perspective and a security perspective. And if our leaders, particularly liberals, can't talk about that, you're never going to drive the consensus nor the premiers to the table on the solutions that you need.
So on interprovincial trade barriers, I agree with you completely, and that's something that the federal government and the provinces should be able to work together on. And I agree with you as well that we've got to approve some of these pipelines. I just can't believe that the provinces are going to give up their right to regulate, when in fact the Supreme Court said that was their right, and the federal government was the one that was imposing its voice into the topic. So we're faced with some problems here. We got to take a break though for some messages and come back with Eric Lombardi in just 2 minutes to talk more about his interesting article about it's time for the Liberal Party to be liberal again. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest tonight is Eric Lombardi. He's written a really fascinating article that got published last week about the Liberal Party needs to become liberal again. Eric is the founder and president of an organization called More Neighbours Toronto, a volunteer organization committed to ending the housing crisis. Professionally, he is a strategy management consultant in the finance and technology sectors. Eric, I got to ask you about some of the other things that you addressed in your article. You talked about immigration, and you talked about how we didn't have a good immigration policy. Tell me why you thought our immigration policy over the course of the last couple of years was wrong.
Yeah, so I want to say that immigration is actually core to the Canadian identity. Almost all of us can trace our history back to immigration, typically even within 2 to 3 generations. It would cover nearly everyone in the country today. And so, we had for about 40 years a very consistent, broadly popular immigration policy in which we brought in about 1% of the current population. And we did it with, strong criteria on the economic and cultural contributions that people would make, and with the expressed intent of these individuals being able to live and become Canadians and live out the Canadian dream. In COVID, we made a major departure from this long established and broadly popular policy. We enabled far more temporary immigrants to come to Canada, both international students and temporary foreign workers, where we went from seeing net flat numbers of temporary immigrants to 800,000 per year for 3 years, right? And so our population growth rate, all of a sudden, after being stable around 1% for 40 years, jumps to nearly 4%, higher than some countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And in many ways, this was done because of the lobby from low-wage workers who, through leveraging temporary workers, were able to undercut the competition that derived from the COVID lockdowns on low-wage labor. And this means that they didn't have to make as many investments in productivity. They didn't need to raise the offering wages to attract more workers to those industries. And in many ways, we've exploited so many international students at fraudulent colleges. We've seen major scams happen in the labor market impact assessment, which brought in temporary foreign workers. And it has strained infrastructure, healthcare capacity, and housing capacity because our provinces and our cities, they can't build this stuff overnight, right? So it was a major demand shock. And, the justification for it wasn't even all that clear. And so immigration isn't something that should be a short-term lever that ebbs and flows with, the ups and downs of the economy. It's a long-term strategy to create new Canadians and contribute to the growth of this country with people.
So the justification was
yeah.
that our birth rate has declined dramatically. We're not replacing ourselves, and so therefore, without immigration, our population would decline. And that the statistic was when I was your age, there were 5 people working for every senior that was supported by government, and in 10 years, there's going to be 2 people working for every person that is in their senior years and has to be supported by government. And so therefore, we needed immigration to grow our workforce such that we would have a workforce that could sustain our senior population effectively and create the economic growth that we need to fuel our government revenue.
Yeah,
I think
and
that's
temporary
justifiable.
immigration has nothing to do with that argument, right? Like if even with Canada's current birth rate, if we maintained a population growth rate of 1.2%, we will have more than 100 million people in the country by 2100. So jumping from what was around that growth rate already for permanent, full-time, like permanent immigration with the express intent of creating Canadian citizens was already at that level,
So you're
right?
saying we didn't have to increase it, the historic level of immigration was
Jumping to
fine.
3.5 to 4% almost entirely on the backs of temporary immigration, A, does not contribute to actually alleviating that problem. It's created a major demand shock as well because this labor is actually contributing less than the overall current GDP per capita of the country. We've actually ended up seeing declines in productivity and overall wealth in Canada when you look at it as a per person basis. So I buy all the arguments that you're saying, and they're the great justification for permanent long-term immigration that we were already doing to, you know, credit from literally the rest of the world. The mistake that the liberals made on immigration was not in permanent immigration, it was in temporary immigration. And
You
the
also
cynicism
indicated
around
a,
that implementation was a fundamental failure.
you also indicated another mistake. You said, and I quote again, worse, integration became an afterthought, risking the transfer of old world rivalries that strain our social fabric and undermine pluralism. Integration. So you're saying that we allowed into our country people that didn't integrate, or we didn't work hard enough at integrating them, and they brought old world rivalries to Canada?
I didn't say that they've brought them. I'd say that we've risked bringing them. And if you look at, for example, some of the tensions around conflicts in, Israel Palestine right now, and we're seeing a lot of tension between those two communities, right? We need to make sure that when Canadians are immigrating to the country, that they're coming here not just for the economic benefits, but for the cultural benefits of living in a society that is free, pluralistic, in which people's differences are respected in a framework under openness and freedom.
How do you do
And
that?
well, I think the first thing is you screen for it, and you actually need to interview people what their values are when they're coming into the country. And I don't think we need to be strict. I actually think we've been very successful in our permanent immigration screens for a very long period of time. I think that if you have too quick of a population adjustment, if too many immigrants come from only one part of the world, you're not going to create integration. You're going to create fragmentation, people who settle in their own communities of people who are like them in similar places from where they're from. So, so it's important for us to consider the rate as being something that can be culturally manageable. And I do think because immigration is so important to Canada and to our identity, it's important for us to make sure that Canadians have confidence in the immigration system that we have. And for a very long time, we did. And what that's one of the big mistakes is because of the changes that happened post-COVID that were implemented without very much thought, we now have this huge questioning of immigration in general. And it's even threatening our long-term plans and long-term need for permanent immigration. So if liberals open the doors and all of a sudden Canadians have lost, their openness to immigration, that's really taken something from what was once core to the Canadian identity. And we have to recognize that as the failure that it is.
Another one you talk about is the government's approach to regulating speech that you think has turned illiberal. You said that our Ottawa is empowering, instead of champion free expression, Ottawa is empowering secret commissions to divide and censor Canadians behind closed doors.
Yeah.
Seriously? The
So
Liberals have been against free speech?
there are two acts that have had, I think, real consequences in information landscape. So, the online, I believe it's C61, um, is the act that wanted to force both Meta and Google to pay domestic creators for any syndication that anyone was doing on their platforms. And the consequence of that was you can't share any Canadian journalism anymore on Facebook or Instagram. And so if you can't share a source like the Globe and Mail or the Toronto Star, what are the sources of information that people are going to be going to as a result of that? And is that a good outcome? I think that's a pretty bad outcome, and it's fundamentally illiberal because you are holding back people's ability to share good information. And so there needs to be some ownership of that type of result.
Are Mark Carney and Chrystia Freeland the people that would actually listen to your argument and change?
I have no idea. I hope they do.
Have you had much response to your article?
I've had quite a bit of response. I would say, there's sort of two categories of response. I think, I had a lot of big L liberals say that, like, yes, like this is some of the direction that we need to be thinking about and going into, and that's been great. I do think there's a second category that has said, Canada went through a very hard time with COVID. We managed it better than a lot of other countries, which, I would say, is true. That, I'm not talking enough about important issues like the environment. And, I'll note that I didn't mention the carbon tax the entire time in the article because I actually am a supporter of it. And then, number three is the Liberals have done some very good things, particularly when it comes to social policy around children. The childcare benefit that was brought in, quite quickly has alleviated childhood poverty in this country. A lot of people do rely now on, lower cost daycare. Was the implementation perfect? No, but it certainly was an advance in, welfare rights for families. So, I think the criticism is I haven't given them enough credit, but I think broadly on specifically the economic pieces, I think there's a lot of agreement there.
Well, you talk about sluggish productivity, soaring housing costs, ballooning debt. And it's interesting because you quote some statistics. And again, I'm going to quote from your article here. Our per capita GDP growth sits near the bottom of the OECD, and household debt has climbed to 175% of disposable income, among the highest worldwide. Meanwhile, we've dropped from fifth in the World Happiness Report in 2015 to 13th in 2023, with under 30 Canadians bearing the worst of it at 58th. And you do credit them. You say we've accomplished a lot of good, expanding child benefits, rolling out dental coverage for families without private insurance, and boosting social support. But if we refuse to confront our shortcomings, why should Canadians trust our leadership? Our faltering social contract is exactly what a hostile White House aims to exploit. Do you think the White House is hostile?
Of course I do. I like let's bring this back to reality. Donald Trump has said that he wants to use economic force in order to
Coercion.
lure,
Not
fine,
forced, coercion.
fine, economic coercion, which is the same thing as economic force,
No, it's
to
worse.
encourage Canada to become the 51st state. And even the threat of tariffs at this level, we have to recognize is an economic attack. Because if you are going to thinking about investing in North America and Canadian production, and America is going to be an export market for you, all of a sudden that decision just became a lot more risky. And so I think we need to have a bit of an eyes wide open perspective on the current administration in the US as not being an entity that sees Canada as the historic ally, partner, and friend that it is. There is a zero sum mindset there, and we're seeing a return to imperial thinking. And so when we are thinking about how we defend our country, we're also not just defending our economy, we are also defending our underlying values. And the area that I think Trump and the Americans can exploit more than any is really the declining sense of hope in the future that's happened for those who live in this country under 40. And I think my generation in particular has faced what I call a milestone recession, where the rise in cost of living, the additional credential requirements in education have delayed financial stability, and in data, delays in marriages and delays in the age and number of children that we have. And all this culminates in real cultural outcomes of cynicism, demoralization, etc. And so when you look at even polling, the demographic most open to becoming the 51st state are Canadians under 40. And so the failure to deliver, even the perception of a prosperous future has been a major failure. for the last 10 years of all governments of all stripes, but particularly the federal government, because they do carry the attention of the media. And we look to their leadership on these core issues. And the record is not good, right? So we need to deliver for the people of the country much better for their outcomes materially. And then we have to see the threat that Trump means to our way of life and to our future from an economics perspective and a cultural one.
Strong words, Eric. I want to take a break for some messages and come back and really delve into this housing issue and the intergenerational real inequality that I think that you're addressing, because I think that is a major issue, and one that if someone solves or suggests they've got some way of solving, they could increase turnout dramatically and really change the flavor of the upcoming election. Your article is excellent. If people want to get a copy of it and read it, how can they best do that?
Go to the hub.ca. I'm a regular contributor, so look up Eric Lombardi, and it's my latest article, so it should be listed first.
I recommend this, everyone. It's a really interesting article, extremely well written. Why the Liberal Party needs to become liberal again. I recommend it highly. We're going to take a break and come back in 2 minutes with Eric Lombardi, and we're going to really delve into housing and intergenerational inequity. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest tonight is Eric Lombardi, and he's written a really interesting article called "It's Time to Make the Liberal Party Liberal Again." And he writes it as a speech that he wishes either Mark Carney or Chrystia Freeland had actually given to launch their leadership campaigns. Eric, in the 2015 election, Justin Trudeau won a majority government, which lots of people were surprised by, mainly because some people think that turnout increased dramatically and young people came out in huge numbers to support the Liberal Party. Some people think because of his promise to decriminalize marijuana, but people, whether it was that or whether it was more, people thought that he was going to address young people's issues. You point out in this discussion and in your article that really, other than the decriminalization of marijuana, that really hasn't come to pass, and that our housing is unaffordable. You talk about the issues in regards to regulation and red tape. You criticize Ontario and British Columbia fairly dramatically in this regard. I've interviewed some people with groups on intergenerational inequity, and they've said that this is the highest level of intergenerational inequity in history, that this is the first generation in history that is going to pass on to the next generation a worse economic future, given high housing prices, high levels of taxation, high levels of debt, lack of productivity, lack of real income growth, etc. And they've suggested that that could actually lead to civil unrest. Tell me how you feel about how people of your age group are being treated by people of my age group, of our governmental system, of our current generational inequity that have dealt up these red tape, these regulations that have made housing, as you've said, doubled in the last couple of years, twice as expensive on a per disposable income basis as the United States, and not necessarily giving you an economy that is going to promise you a great economic future. Tell me a little bit about that, please.
Yeah. And the first thing I want to say here is I don't think older Canadians have been deliberate in trying to weaponize public policy against the young people. I think it's just a culmination of a bunch of easy decisions that were easy to say, hey, this benefits me, but also not really looking at, well, what are the consequences of this benefit? And if you add those up, what we've seen is a major inequality in what public policy is driving between generations, right? So, everything I say here isn't an attack on older Canadians. It's just my opinion that some of the things that we've allowed to occur have made these bad results, and it's incumbent on us to change those things. So, for example, if you look at, the Greater Toronto area, housing is a really big focus of mine. And so I'm going to talk about, let's look at just housing policy in general. In the GTA in 2003, we had the Ontario Liberals at the time bring in a new growth plan, which created the Greenbelt at the time. And, I think the Greenbelt is one of the most popular policies that has ever happened still in this province. But in many ways, what we said is, okay, we're actually going to stop sprawling outwards, creating new suburbs, new homes where land is cheap. We're going to impose a constraint. But then what we never did was say, hey, what we need to do is liberalize land use everywhere we've already built because there's still demand, there's still people coming. And then what's happened is, in 1999, if you wanted to build a 2-bedroom condo, you would get charged $1,300 in development charges. It's about $2,500 today. Now the city of Toronto charges $80,000. And you add up all the municipal fees on that.
Hold it.
Right?
You say that in what year the development charge was 2,500? It's now 80,000. 2,500 to 80,000. Seriously?
It's actually 1,300, but if you adjust it for inflation, it's about 2,500. In fact, if you were to look at a 2-bedroom condo in 2000, you could buy one for in real dollars, so inflation adjusted today, about 250,000. And if you look at just the taxes imposed on that new condo today, it would be more than that, right? And so why have we done that? Well, we didn't want to pay higher property taxes, right? Housing prices were growing. Everyone saw it as the cash cow. But what it did is it created a disparity in like for like comparability between existing housing and new housing. And when you're adding population, the price of existing housing has to rise to justify the value of new housing. So what did these policy outcomes mean? Older Canadians who owned their homes got a massive windfall in new equity, resulting largely from land values and competition for housing. Young people got an inability to start their lives on a basic need that's fundamental to their own self-perception of prosperity. And what you've seen in a place like the GTA is what I call the feudalization of our economy. If you are born to a wealthier family, or if you have parents have had enough windfall and they're generous, they might be able to help you get into this expensive housing market. But if you don't have that benefit, if you're a renter, like you've seen this dream slip away. And so even the outcomes that are happening in our society, family wealth has always mattered. It's never been required in order to be prosperous, and it shouldn't be in a liberal society. But now it is. And so we've actually become, in many ways, a much more illiberal economy where hereditary privileges are far more important than they really should be. And this is falling hardest on my generation in particular. And so it's why it's so important that we need to accept some dramatic changes, particularly when it comes to housing policy, but also a number of other policy areas, in my opinion, which includes how we approach education, training, and the start of people's careers, which also in many ways has deprived them and young people of the growth early on in life that sets them out for financial success in the long term.
Such as what? What are you going to do with starting out in careers?
So, wealth compounds, right? This is, a very well-known fact. So the earlier that you're able to get financial stability as a young person, the more wealth you'll be able to accumulate over your lifetime, and therefore the higher living standards and the more material well-being that you will have. And so we need to look at what's actually happened in our economy to starting out. So we've seen a major inflation in credential requirements. So young people need to go into schools for longer periods of time, and they're a little bit older when they even get to start their careers. And this doesn't just apply to university education, although it's certainly true there as well. But if you look at, for example, if you're going to become an electrician, it used to be 2 years school, 3 years apprenticeship. And then it became 3 years of school and 4 years of apprenticeship. And now it's actually about to become 4 years of school and about 5 years of apprenticeship, right? We've consistently ratcheted up the barriers to getting credentialed. And those credentials also, once again, aren't cross-applicable across provinces. So both on the university side and the corporate side, the credential demands have increased, but so have too on the blue collar side. And so people are starting their careers a little bit later. And then if you look at entry-level salaries, I'm a consultant, and in 2010, entry-level salaries in this industry were about 65,000 to 70,000 a year. And today in Toronto, it's actually still about the same amount, despite the changes in the cost of living. And so young people in this economy have both seen the cost of rent and housing skyrocket, and the ability to get a foothold in your career not become any stronger, and entry-level incomes become worse. And this has led to some other cultural outcomes, like hustle culture. Many people under the age of 35 need a core job and a side hustle. But what's happened is people don't have the time to spend on other things that bring them value and also happiness, right? So if you look at, I was talking to someone who leads a community land trust in Kensington Market, which is one of Toronto's historic neighborhoods and could also never be built again under current public policy. 15 years ago, the neighborhood had a wealth of artists, both in, like visual arts, painting, etc., as well as musicians. And now they don't really have that anymore because people don't have time to work a normal job and then find pleasure in other areas that bring value to them as humans. And I think people in this city feel that cultural loss that has come with putting so much stress and burden on just the core basics. So all of these factors, I think, have made young people less financially secure. They're going to be poorer as a result in the long term because they're not going to accumulate wealth early on when it has the most potential to snowball. And they've lost elements of culture and pathways for happiness. And that's affecting our culture overall. People are very angry these days, right? We feel it everywhere. The negativity is around us.
In
right?
in the polls that I've seen, electoral turnout for people under the age of 34 is less than 20%. So if they're so upset, why don't you go vote?
Well, who's been providing a really great option? I don't think I've heard a singular politician say, in order for housing to be affordable, housing needs to cost less, right? Because politicians are afraid of the dominant big demographic, which is older Canadians, and older Canadians consistently vote for their own interests, despite what most individuals would say.
Okay, so if you increase supply dramatically, the value of a house that I or people of my age group own would go down dramatically. How do you respond to them?
Yes, but what's important about increasing supply is you can't increase supply at current prices. So the government needs to lower the cost to build the incremental amount of space. So when you look at the fact that 30% of the cost of new housing is just taxes, you need to address that. When, permitting delays, and, I'm going to give you a great statistic here. In Denmark, it takes an average of 64 days to secure a building permit. In Canada broadly, it takes 265 days. And in Toronto, it takes 25 months, right? More than 3 times the amount it does, or nearly 3 times the amount it does for the country at large, right? These are government barriers, and every month
if we
of
have that
delay
extra time
costs.
and barriers, do we have better housing? Is it stronger? Is it more sustainable? Is there some benefit to that extra time and hassle?
No, because the main barrier is actually rezoning. It doesn't even apply to the building code, the standards. It takes 12 to 24 months to go through a rezoning process, which is to say, I have the right to build a certain amount of density on my plot of land. Like everything that affects the quality of housing is building code. That's independent of the major delay in the process. And so we have been, and every municipality has their own special, unique plethora of reports, etc., required to do this. There's no standards, and therefore no ability for this industry to see additional scale. And that's why construction is the only industry in Canada to have productivity levels that are still at the same levels as in 1970, which is crazy, right? And that's been a direct outcome of public policy, and in many ways, older voters who secured housing at lower prices voting for the public policies that hold and make it harder to build new housing.
Eric, we've got a Liberal leadership campaign going on right now. We've got a federal election probably happening sometime in the next couple of months. We've got a provincial campaign that's probably going to be announced and initiated this week. How are you going to get your message out? How are you going to motivate young people to get involved?
So there's a couple of ways. I am actually working with the Bonnie Crombie campaign as an advisor on housing. So I am helping them with their housing platform. And they already did come out with earlier this year, I mean, actually late last year, they've announced that they're going to eliminate development charges on new housing under 3,000 square feet, as well as the land transfer taxes for first-time home buyers, which, this would reduce the cost of most new housing by $150,000 or more, right? I think, the way that I plan and, I guess is young people are cynical and that cynicism has become captured. And young people feel like there's no political leaders who are willing to speak to them. And broadly speaking, that has been true. But if you don't get involved and you don't take the time to listen, you're not going to get the change. I know that's not a plan, but my hope is I can encourage more people to just show up and make politicians feel like if they do not have a message, that they're at political risk. Someone said to me once, and it was like, I've thought about this every time, like every week since. Politicians want two things. They want to be reelected and they don't want to be yelled at. And so young people need to figure out how to do those things well, and then we're going to get the political results to help our future.
Eric Lombardi, I think one very beneficial way you can do it is by writing articles as powerful as the one that you did about how the Liberal Party needs to become liberal again. Thank you very much for writing the article, and thank you very much for joining us today to chat about it.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
We're going to take a final break, and come back with some concluding comments on this topic from me in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody.